This is the last of our 6 introductory episodes giving an overview of the Montessori approach to education, especially as it applies to young children under age 7. For the next several episodes after this one, we will focus particularly on the resources available to support educators and parents in using this approach, as well as the materials that are essential to Montessori education. Some segments in this episode were filmed on location. While the image and sound quality suffer a little, we hope the value of being able to use these resources makes up for this lacking.
When we're discussing the child, it's very important to realize that although Maria Montessori had very important ideas that were revolutionary at the time that she presented them, there's always more to learn. One of the things that is most important about the ideas that Maria Montessori presented is the idea that key is observing the child. When we look at the role of the teacher, when we look at the role of any of the people who are helping the child move through life and learn, we need to take into consideration that key skill of observation. Even in traditional education today, much too much of what is presented to children has been pre-planned without tailoring that education to the children that are receiving it. With the Montessori method, individualization is key because at any one time there's no two children that are needing the exact same thing. The virtue of the prepared environment in Montessori is that it is able to provide the materials that are likely to be what many children need at any one time. Then within that environment, individual instruction can take place. Individual choices by the children can take place so that each child is able to receive the education that he or she needs while working with the group of other children. Let's look at each of those aspects of the child's education from the Montessori perspective. First of all, let's revisit the child. One of the things that is most key to understand when you are presenting learning to a child, whether it is a mother teaching a child to brush her teeth at home or a teacher preparing an environment for a child and then presenting the exercises in the environment, what is most key is to recognize that that child does not see the world the way you see the world. The things that become uninteresting to you, going over things again and again and again, are not only interesting to the child, they are absolutely key. The need for repetition just cannot be overemphasized when you're looking at the way that young children, particularly between the ages of 3 and 5, learn. They must go over a concept again and again and again. The reason for this is that with each exposure, they are taking on another aspect. For instance, using the Montessori dimensional materials, when a child is first exposed to the knob cylinders and they fit each of those different size cylinders into the holes in the cylinder block, the first thing that's happening is they're just beginning to get a sense of how to solve problems. Once they have a sense of how to approach the problem, then the information inherent in the problem is able to be made available to them. The sense of size discrimination comes later. And then, even after that, becomes the ability, without any movement of the hand, to discriminate the size just with the eye. So this is an example of why, even though it may seem uninteresting to you and overly repetitive, why the child genuinely needs to repeat an exercise or have you read a story again and again and again. They're not trying to annoy you, they simply are wanting to learn at a deeper and deeper and deeper level. Sometimes when a child's request, such as to have the same book, is made over and over and over again, it helps to realize that something is happening that you don't observe. Something is happening with that child that's very, very important to them. And sometimes it makes it a little bit easier for us to cater to their needs for repetition, as well as to go at their own pace. This is another need that is key when you're working with the child, is to not only go at their pace, but to isolate whatever it is that you're teaching them. When you isolate a concept, you make it clear to the child. In one of Montessori's books, she talked about teaching the simple concept of the color names red and blue. And she described having observed a teacher teaching the concept of blue by talking about bluebirds and the color of sky, and beginning the instruction, beginning the lesson with what Montessori considered to be a lie, because she held her closed hand in front of the children and said, "Can you guess what I have in my hand?" And since she hadn't shown it to anyone, of course they couldn't guess. So Montessori actually considered that to be dishonest. But whether it's dishonest or not, it's confusing. If you want to teach a child blue, show them a red object and a blue object. This is red, this is blue, and it's just that simple. Taking into consideration the child's unique ways of learning is what's going to make anything that you do with them more successful. Let's go back to our example of a mother teaching her child to brush their teeth. If you look at that, one of the best ways to figure out how to go about teaching something like that is to break it down into steps. When we are talking about a process as opposed to just matching names to an object, the terminology lesson that I mentioned earlier with the colors, whenever the concept is a process, the easiest way to make it accessible to the child is to break it down into individual steps. In the case of toothbrushing, it would be useful to then emphasize the first 2 or 3 steps each day until that was very clear to the child. Maybe things like how much toothpaste to put on the toothbrush, and positioning the toothbrush in their hand in a way that's comfortable for them to actually move it around. Then maybe on a later night we would talk about how there's different areas of the mouth and we want to make sure we get to all the different parts of the teeth. And then finally the specific motion could be emphasized, because all along you'll have been guiding the child in that way. Sometimes the very best way to teach something like a motion is simply to place your hand over the child and teach them the little circular motion that's most efficient to clean their teeth. In the Montessori environment, one of the things that Montessori emphasized was that the best way to teach a child some careful movements, such as touching the texture tablets lightly enough so that you didn't hurt your hand, but you were able to feel that texture, one of the best ways to teach that was to simply guide the child's hand over the texture tablets. The point here is that when you're teaching the child, if you take into consideration what they need, planning it ahead, and then presenting step by step what they need, they are going to learn most easily. When we look at the child's way of learning, it's very important to remember the absorbent mind. With the absorbent mind, the child has an ability to take in information that's very profound. The child's ability to listen to the sounds of a language being spoken and to sort out when one family member is speaking English and another family member is speaking Italian or Chinese is very different than that of the adult. That's one of the reference experiences that I like to use when I describe the absorbent mind, because most people have seen this, have seen a child without any formal language instruction be able to pick up more than one language simply by exposure. That is not the only thing that the child is able to pick up in this way. One of the ways that instruction is done in a Montessori classroom is something called the 3-period lesson. This is something that was developed by a French doctor named Sagan when he was instructing children who had what we would call learning disabilities today. And it's a very, very simple lesson. The first period is simply assigning the name of an object and associated with that object. This is blue, this is red. The second period of the 3-period lesson is asking the child to recognize that object, to notice whether, having been given the name, if the child can then see what in their environment has that name. Show me blue. Give me the red tablet. And the final period is asking the child to remember that name. What is this? What is this? So it's a very, very simple way to isolate the concept and to avoid the confusion that I mentioned earlier in the lesson that Montessori described when she observed the teacher that brought in all sorts of unnecessary details when she was trying to teach the simple concept of red or the simple concept of the color blue. One piece that sometimes is left out when people are considering the three-period lesson, which is a very, very well-known structure in Montessori education, is that Montessori said there is a period before period one, and this is one of the things that makes her method unique. This is the period of real, pure sensory education. Many of the lessons that Montessori gave with her materials were silent or virtually silent, maybe containing only a few words to guide the child how to use the material properly. In giving a lesson with the cylinder block that I referred to earlier, particularly since it's a relatively large piece of apparatus that 2.5-year-olds are using, one key is simply to show the child where to place their hands so that they can carry the heavy wooden block to a place to use it to work with it. So that would be a place where words are useful. After that, the first presentation with that material would simply be to remove all of the cylinder blocks and perhaps replace one and then let the child replace the rest. No words are needed at all. The reason that I point this out is that the magic in Montessori education is the learning that really can't happen with very much assistance from a teacher. The environment has to be the teacher. The prepared environment with materials that give the children the information that allows them to order their mind. That is what Montessori believed that her dimensional materials were. They were ways for the children, through repeated exposure to these different size objects, very carefully calibrated, to give them a format, to give them a structure with which to put all the rest of the content of their lives. And it's not something that a teacher can teach. It is only through repeated experience with materials of different size that the child can take in through the hands and through the eyes that relative sense of dimension. That training comes before the first period. Then words such as larger, smaller, tallest, shortest are very appropriate when using those materials. But if that pre-first period education doesn't come, then all of the other things that are to be built upon it are not going to be as strong. One of the key ways that Montessori materials are presented is using something called the Sagan three-period lesson.
Maria Montessori made extensive studies of the work of the French physician Edward Sagan and his approach to teaching children with learning difficulties.
This lesson that I'm about to show you is a framework that is used over and over again anytime you are introducing a child to terminology. If you are wanting them to understand the name of an object that is associated with an object, this three-period lesson works beautifully. The first period of the three-period lesson is you naming the object. This is an ellipse. This is a square. This is a circle. That is period one of the three-period lesson. Next, you ask the child, usually in reverse order for the most success, show me the circle. The child points. Hand me the square. The child gives me the square. Give me the ellipse. Notice the way that I sequenced that. I labeled the objects for them. I asked them to observe and show me that they could observe the ones that they were most likely to be successful with, the familiar circle and square, and the last ones that I had said when I did the first period of naming the objects. So naming, asking the child to locate or recognize they can observe the object, and then the third period. The third period is asking them to actually show that they've made the knowledge a part of themselves. What is this? If they have made the knowledge a part of themselves, they'll be able to tell me it's a circle. What is this? Square. What is this? I don't know. So now I'm going to back up. Circle, square, ellipse. Show me the ellipse. Show me the circle. Show me the square. So what we do is in the 3-period lesson, as much as we can, we structure the child successfully integrating the knowledge into themselves. We give them the name. We ask them to recognize the object by its name. And then we find out whether or not the name and the association between the name and the object has become a part of them. Do I correct the child? If instead of saying, I don't know, the child had said, that's a curvilinear triangle, would I say it was a curvilinear triangle? No. I would do exactly the same thing that I did. This is a circle. This is a square. This is an ellipse. Instead of correcting, we represent. In fact, when a child has a lesson in the Montessori classroom, usually one of two things are recorded: that the child mastered the lesson and doesn't need any more help from the directress or the guide, or the lesson needs to be represented, or that the child is somewhere in between. If the child didn't have even the recognition of any of these objects, that would be a represent, which means I would simply do the whole lesson again for them at another time. This leads us back to the absorbent mind and to the sensitive periods of the absorbent mind. There are particular time frames in which the child is most able to absorb particular types of information. Usually it's considered from birth to 6 that is the sensitive period for language. If a child is exposed to a language after the age of 6, it is likely never to be as easy for them to learn that language as any that they were exposed to at age 6 or younger. Given this information, the need for the child at a very young age 3 to 4 particularly, to be given a prepared environment, to be given those dimensional materials with which to explore and build the structure in their mind on which everything else is then going to be able to be stored efficiently, is why the Montessori environment and having the child be able to spend time in the Montessori environment is so key. Does this mean that if the child wasn't exposed to the knob cylinders and the pink tower before they were 5 years old, that they've been irreparably damaged? No, of course not. But there is an advantage there that needs to be considered. And if you are fortunate enough to be working in a fully furnished Montessori environment, this is one of the reasons why it's key to make sure that you don't put things off too long. Montessori said that when a child is exposed to a material, when they're given a first presentation or a first experience of it, if they don't make several mistakes, you were late. You should have been presenting that material earlier, because it is by making the mistakes and then using the material over and over again to learn what it was meant to teach, that's when it can have the most impact. That's when it is most useful. So when we see materials such as the bead stair, this is the colored beads that are from 1 to 10 and are designed to teach the children about quantity. It is also presented as a sensorial material, because the children, even before they're ready to remember the sequence of numbers, before they've had any exposure to numerals, can still take the sensory information of a single bead and 2 beads and 3 beads and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 and bring those into their mind as a sensory experience. So that is one of the reasons why it's very important to understand what the child needs. This is gained through 3 different paths. One is that observation. If you're a mother in the home and you are deciding how to instruct your child in just the daily life activities, that's your most important tool, is the observation. Second is the planning. Even if you are not in a prepared Montessori environment, even if you are just in the home, recognizing the pieces of what the child needs to learn and then planning out how to present that is key. The toothbrushing example is one of those. To simply think through, what is the process of this, and what does the child need to accomplish? What's the aim? To have them clean the teeth efficiently and not swallow more toothpaste than they need to. So what are the steps we need to teach so that that's going to happen? So that's the second key, is to plan out how to isolate each concept that you need to direct the child's attention appropriately. And the third piece of that is an understanding of the child based on Montessori's work, based on the work of Piaget, and the people who have studied the Montessori method extensively. Usually in Montessori training, there's guidelines as to which materials precede other materials and what ages it is appropriate to give these materials to. So that kind of a research can be very, very key. Most people, if they were not given some exposure to Montessori's orientation, wouldn't think that the teaching of the polygons is something that's very, very appropriate for a 4-year-old, but that is exactly the age, possibly even a little before, that knowledge should be introduced sensorially with an inset that all that needs to be done with that inset is that the child traces it and places it back where it belongs. Possibly in the case of the polygons with more sides, that the child would be taught how to count the sides of the polygon. That's all that's needed. Do we talk about angles and area?